Millions of children have lived and died throughout human history. Almost all of them disappeared without leaving a trace. But one child changed the story of our species. The strange part is, they never grew up. Their skull was no larger than a grapefruit. Their brain wasn't fully developed. They couldn't hunt. They couldn't lead. They couldn't invent anything. Yet when scientists uncovered their tiny fossil in South Africa, it shattered one of the biggest scientific beliefs of the 20th century. Until then, many researchers believed our ancestors had evolved somewhere in Europe or Asia. This child suggested something completely different, that the story of humanity began in Africa. More than a fossil. This child became the evidence that forced scientists to rewrite our family tree. But how could the remains of a child overturn decades of scientific certainty? And why did so many experts refuse to believe it? To answer that, we have to travel back to a dusty limestone quarry in South Africa. In 1924, the quarry itself looked ordinary. Workers blasted limestone from pale cliffs, searching for material used in construction. Fossils occasionally appeared inside the rock. Most attracted little attention. Then, one afternoon, a small block of limestone arrived at the of an anatomy professor named Raymond Dart. Embedded inside was the face of a child. At first glance, it resembled a young ape. The skull was tiny. The teeth were still developing. The individual had died at only 3 or 4 years of age. Nothing about it suggested one of the greatest discoveries in human evolution. But Dart noticed something almost everyone else would have overlooked. He carefully removed the surrounding rock, exposing the underside of the skull. There, at the base, was a single opening called the foramen magnum. Every vertebrate has one. It is the hole where the spinal cord enters the skull, but its position reveals something remarkable. In animals that walk on 4 legs, the opening sits farther toward the back of the skull. The head projects forward from the spine. In humans, it sits much closer to the center underneath the skull. The head balances naturally on top of the spine while walking upright. The tiny fossil from Taung looked much more like the second pattern. Its brain was still small, but its body appeared adapted for bipedal walking. That combination created an enormous problem. At the time, many scientists believed human evolution had followed a simple sequence. First, the brain became large. Only later did our ancestors begin walking upright. The Taung Child suggested the exact opposite. Upright walking may have appeared long before a modern human brain. If that was true, one of the central ideas about human evolution was wrong. Raymond Dart published his conclusion in 1925. He believed the Taung Child represented one of our earliest ancestors. He believed humanity's story began in Africa. Almost nobody agreed. Looking back, that reaction seems strange. Today, Africa is accepted as the birthplace of humanity. The Taung Child appears in textbooks around the world. So why did so many experts reject it? The answer wasn't the fossil. It was the world the fossil had entered. At the time, scientists thought they already knew what early humans should look like. They expected one feature above all others: a large brain. Intelligence, they believed, was what separated humans from every other animal. Walking upright would come later. The Taung Child showed the opposite. Its brain was still tiny. Yet the position of the foramen magnum suggested the head balanced on top of the spine. This child may already have been walking upright, if Dart was right. Human evolution had happened in the opposite order that was difficult enough to accept. But there was another obstacle. Geography. Many European scientists expected humanity to have evolved somewhere in Europe, or perhaps Asia. Africa was rarely considered the center of the story. A child from South Africa did not fit the picture they already believed. And then there was one final problem. perhaps the biggest one of all. 14 years before the Taung Child was discovered, England had celebrated another fossil. It became known as Piltdown Man. Its skull looked surprisingly human. Large brain, ape-like jaw. It seemed to prove exactly what scientists expected. Intelligence had evolved first. Piltdown became one of the most famous fossils in the world. Museums displayed it. Scientists cited it. Textbooks repeated its story against that backdrop. Raymond Dart was asking the scientific world to believe something completely different. A child, from Africa, with a small brain, walking upright. It wasn't simply a new fossil. It contradicted almost everything people thought they already knew. The fossil wasn't the problem. The story was. For nearly 30 years, Raymond Dart waited. Not because his fossil had changed, but because science needed time to catch up. New discoveries slowly began appearing across Africa. At first, they seemed isolated. Another skull, a few teeth, part of a pelvis, fragments of a foot. None of them settled the argument alone. But together, they began telling the same story. Again and again, researchers found ancient relatives with small brains. Yet, bodies adapted for walking upright. The pattern refused to disappear. Every new fossil made the Taung Child look a little less unusual. And then, something unexpected happened. The fossil that had overshadowed the Taung Child collapsed. Piltdown Man had been accepted for decades as one of humanity's earliest ancestors. But improved scientific testing revealed a very different truth. It wasn't an ancient human at all. It was a deliberate forgery, a modern human skull, combined with the jaw of an orangutan, artificially stained to look ancient. One of the most influential fossils in the world had never existed. Overnight, one of the foundations of human evolution disappeared, and with it, many of the assumptions that had kept scientists from accepting the Taung Child. Raymond Dart didn't suddenly become right because Piltdown was exposed. He became right because the evidence kept growing, while the illusion fell apart. By the 1950s and beyond, discoveries from Sterkfontein, Makapansgat, Olduvai Gorge, and later Lucy in Ethiopia all pointed in the same direction. Walking upright had appeared millions of years before modern human intelligence. And Africa, not Europe, was where the deepest roots of humanity could be found. The Taung Child had not solved the mystery alone. It had asked the right question first. Sometimes, that is how science changes. Not through one spectacular discovery, but through many discoveries, all refusing to tell a different story. It seemed the investigation was finally over, but decades later, scientists looked at the tiny skull one more time. This time, they weren't asking where humanity came from. They were asking something far more personal. How had this child died? For almost a century, the Taung Child was famous for changing the story of human evolution. But in the early 2000s, scientists began looking at the fossil from a completely different angle. They stopped asking, "Who was this child?" and started asking, "What happened to them?" Tiny marks surrounded the eye sockets. There were scratches across the skull, small punctures, too precise to be random. At first, no one knew what they meant. They didn't resemble weathering. They didn't match damage from the quarry. And they weren't consistent with ordinary decay. Then researchers made an unexpected comparison. They looked at modern primates killed by crowned eagles. Today, crowned eagles are among Africa's most powerful hunters. They attack from above. Their talons strike the head first. The eye sockets often become the first point of contact. The injuries they leave behind are surprisingly distinctive. When scientists compared those skulls with the Taung Child, the similarities were difficult to ignore. The puncture marks, the damage around the eyes, even the pattern of fractures, none of it proved the case beyond doubt. Fossils almost never do. But many paleoanthropologists now consider eagle predation the most convincing explanation, if they're right. This child's final moments were unimaginably brief: a shadow overhead, a sudden strike, and silence. It's a haunting image. One of the most important fossils ever discovered may owe its survival to an ordinary hunt. The eagle wasn't preserving history. It was simply trying to survive, yet by chance. That single hunt preserved evidence that would remain hidden for nearly 3 million years. The Taung Child never changed the past. The child changed our understanding of the past. Raymond Dart never asked the world to believe a story. He asked it to look at the evidence. At first, almost no one did. But evidence has one remarkable advantage. It doesn't care what people believe. It waits. Sometimes for years, sometimes for generations, until enough pieces exist to reveal the bigger picture. The Taung Child was never the largest fossil, never the oldest, never the most complete. Yet it became one of the most important, not because it answered every question, but because it asked one that science could no longer ignore. What if everything we believed about our origins was backwards? Nearly a century later, that tiny skull is still changing the way we see ourselves. History isn't always rewritten by the biggest discovery. Sometimes it's rewritten by the smallest one.